Steve Adubato with my colleague Mary Gamba. Mary, why don't we introduce our very special guest who's talking about leadership in the nonprofit world and a whole range of other issues. Please, Mary.
Yeah, happy to do so. Michael Schmidt, Executive Director and CEO of the Healthcare Foundation of New Jersey. Michael, so glad to have you back with us once again to talk all things leadership.
Yeah, and
Thank you, Mary.
Sorry for interrupting, Michael. That's the difference, studio versus remote. But Michael, all things leadership, but related to leadership as well. And to disclose, the Healthcare Foundation is a major underwriter of ours in our healthcare programming. But one of the things, Michael, I want to talk to you about is leadership and anti-Semitism. More specifically, the initiative at the Healthcare Foundation dealing with the extraordinary, painful, difficult challenges that folks are facing as it relates to anti-Semitism, as it relates to mental health, and the initiative of the Healthcare Foundation to address that directly. Please talk about it.
Thank you, Steve, and thank you, Mary. It's great to be back on broadcast with you. As you know, Steve and Mary, there's been a rise in anti-Semitism around the world, and specifically here in the United States. Statistics say that anti-hate crimes against Jews are #1. There was just a report in today's newspaper saying that within schools, that anti-Semitism has risen against the LGBT community, Jews and Blacks. So recognizing that our youth are faced with increasing isolation, depression, anxiety, and other kinds of mental health challenges that have emerged, not just from the rise in anti-Semitism and the events that have happened since October 7th, but also as a result of the pandemic and tremendous amount of isolation that they incurred. We recently issued an RFP in the community to address the mental health of youth and teens. And particularly, we were asking community partner members in the Greater Essex area to collaborate with one another and to come up with new and innovative techniques, or techniques that have been found to be successful in other parts of the country that can be replicated here in New Jersey to address this level of anxiety within the Jewish community.
Along those lines, before Mary jumps back in, from my perspective, and again, I'm not here to editorialize, but it seems like every obstacle, challenge, barrier, terrible situation like this, and to those who are negatively affected in the Palestinian community, there's just as much concern, and we'll do focused programming in that regard as well. But the issue of rising anti-Semitism, a serious problem, which also presents, dare I say, an opportunity, Michael, to respond in the appropriate way. Is that not the essence of leadership, to take every challenge and see it as an opportunity to do better? Please.
Steve, you know, I just want to contextualize that anti-Semitism is not a problem just for the Jewish community. It's a problem for everybody. I think everybody who is a decent and a caring human being wants to know that they can be able to live in a society where one individual or one group of individuals is not singled out, is not addressed, is not taunted, not bullied, and not meant to felt as a secondary kind of citizen. And that's true for everybody, whether you're Muslim, whether you're Jewish, whether you're Catholic, or whatever you may be. And I know that all of my friends, partners in the Muslim community have also suffered tremendous amounts of bullying. But I think what is unique within the Jewish community is that this has reared, unfortunately, its ugly head much more in the last year, when people thought that we had been making progress. And to your question, leadership is exactly about that. It's about speaking out for everyone and taking stand to make sure that everyone feels protected, safe, and able to participate in society to the best of his or her ability.
Yeah, along those lines, Mary, I don't know why I even framed it that way. That was not only inappropriate, but wrong to say we'll focus on Palestinians who have been victimized in this, because it's not one or the other. An attack on one is an attack on all. Along those lines, Mary, please jump in.
Yeah, definitely, Michael. I would like to talk a little bit more, I really along the same vein of the shortage in healthcare workers, in particular mental healthcare workers. What more of an impact, how much more strain is that putting? Because if I'm hearing you correctly, and you can't turn on the news without hearing the impact, especially on our young adults, on their mental health, their behavioral health, and just overall issues of depression, suicide. What more needs to happen to make sure that we have the professionals available and accessible to our most vulnerable citizens?
So, Mary, it's an excellent point that you're raising. There is a dearth of qualified professionals, particularly clinicians. And when you speak to anyone who is looking and searching for a qualified clinician, the wait list is often 6 months long or longer. And so this is a longer term issue with an immediate crisis. We speak to our community partners, whether they be in the Jewish Family Services, or whether they be in other kinds of clinical settings that are trying to provide assistance. And we know that, number one, it's hard for them to find qualified people. Much of the money that had been available during the pandemic through the PPE and other kinds is now dissipating. And so some of the ability of organizations and nonprofits in particular to try and use that money to leverage and bring in good qualified clinicians, even on a part-time basis. I know you've had partners that we fund on this show who are in that field, will acknowledge that this is increasingly a challenge. And New Jersey has recognized this by recently changing some of the rules around social workers in particular, and clinicians and social workers, and expanding the ability of people to reach across certain state lines in order to provide clinical service.
You know, Mary, it's interesting you raised this issue about mental health professionals and the dearth, the shortage, if you will, and also then Michael responding about the federal COVID money drying up, meaning this is what's on my mind when you raise that, Michael. We're doing a whole range of interviews with leaders in the not-for-profit community. The graphic will come up on the nonprofit leadership in the nonprofit community in this way. How much more pressure does it put on a foundation like yours to pick up the slack when the government, the federal government says, that's it, we're done, COVID's done, that extra money, whatever extra means, for nonprofits and others, it's not there. Does that not put more pressure on the Healthcare Foundation and other philanthropic organizations, foundations that care deeply about nonprofits?
Well, absolutely. And we've seen in the last few quarters a record number of requests for funding, way beyond what we typically have seen in the past number of years. And so unfortunately, we've had to either decline or defer some of those requests. But, you know, Steve, we feel honored and privileged to be able to be a part of this solution and to be able to try and support the nonprofits. But when you talk about a nonprofit organization which is trying to raise money in general for its operating costs, and funding has been eliminated or is reduced, it makes an even greater challenge for those CEOs and executive directors and staff members who need to go out of their way to try to come up with new resources. And so, yes, the philanthropic world has felt that, and we have a duty and an obligation to step up as best we can and to support those organizations. But this is a challenge, and even with what we call third sector funding from the philanthropic world, will not be addressed without government and public funding to reach in and to support where there are gaps.
Absolutely. Mary, you got a minute left, please.
Yeah, definitely. And one other leadership gap, and Michael, you and I have talked offline about this a little bit, but is the succession planning that is really tied to baby boomers retiring, whether we're talking about leaders of nonprofits. Steve and I have seen it now. We're 24 years in working together. We have tons of people around us that are retiring. What can and should be happening from a leadership standpoint to make sure that there are people adequately ready to lead, to step up, and to fill those roles?
Thanks for raising that very, very important issue, Mary. You know, I think from the first day that a CEO starts, the question needs to be, who is going to be my successor? Who is going to be trained? Who is going to be cultivated? Who is going to have the skill sets to be able to step in? We're seeing a lot of millennials, a lot wanting to take on more responsibility. We're seeing a lot of baby boomers stepping down and retiring, and we need to fill those positions. And most organizations don't spend enough time thinking about the succession planning and what are the skill sets that you need for somebody to be able to step into the role of executive director, whether it's board development, whether it's fundraising, whether it's operations. Each of those need appropriate cultivation, learning, and skill development, and it takes time. And so I hope that many of the organizations that are looking towards the next 5 and 10 years where there's going to be a dearth of leaders will be thinking about that today.
Michael, such an important issue. And as you well know, I come out of the not-for-profit community of my dad, my late dad, who was the leader of the North Ward Center in Newark, where my sister Michelle, who you know well, leads that organization, and the Robert Treat Academy Charter School that my dad started. And of all my dad's greatest qualities, I've said this on the air, he wasn't a big fan of talking succession because he convinced himself he was going to live forever. It's one thing to actually joke about that. It's quite another to deal with the very real challenge of succession and everything that means. And it doesn't mean you just name someone. You have to get that person ready, or those people ready. Hey, Michael, I'll get off my soapbox because this is your segment. Michael Schmidt is the Executive Director, CEO, and CEO of the Healthcare Foundation of New Jersey. Michael, we greatly appreciate your time. Thanks.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you, Mary. Pleasure to be with you.
You got it. Stay with us. We'll be right back. This edition of Lessons in Leadership is made possible by the Buccino Leadership Institute at Seton Hall University, Prager Metis, Valley Bank, the International Union of Operating Engineers Local 825, the North Ward Center, the New Jersey Sharing Network, the Helix, Horizon Blue Cross Blue Shield of New Jersey, Fedway Associates Inc., Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, Veolia, Resourcing the World, Choose New Jersey, and Seton Hall University, showing the world what great minds can do since 1856.
This is Mary Gamba. If you want more leadership tips and tools, log on to stand-deliver.com. That's stand-deliver.com.
Promotional support for this edition of Lessons in Leadership with me, Steve Adubato, and my colleague Mary Gamba has been provided by NJ.com, NJBIA and New Jersey Business Magazine, CIANJ and Commerce Magazine, and the Meadowlands Chamber and Meadowlands Media.
Hello, I'm Donald Payne Jr., Congressman from New Jersey's 10th District. One organ and tissue donor can save as many as 8 lives and improve the health of another additional 75 people. That is why I encourage everyone to register as an organ donor. For more information about organ donation, please visit www.njsharingnetwork.org.
Welcome back to Lessons in Leadership. Steve Adubato with my colleague Mary Gamba. Mary, let's tee this up. I went up to Villa Marie Claire, which is tied to Holy Name Medical Center. It is an extraordinary place, an interesting place. I mean, the interview you're about to see is with Patrick Maron, who's the administrative director of Villa Marie Claire. We'll be talking about logistics, Villa Marie Claire. How would you describe Villa Marie Claire first?
Yeah, well, first of all, it is just a wonderful, wonderful place that when we're all going to be faced with a family member, end of life care. So it's a place where the family and their family members can go for inpatient hospice, but it's more than that. They have everything from horse therapy to activities to support for the family in a comforting environment. We would all love to have our loved ones home at end of life, but when that's not possible, Villa Marie Claire just fills that gap in a caring, supportive, and nurturing way, not just for the patient, but also for the family members and friends.
The other thing about this, and again, I've said this before, I'll say it again, I've never been good in talking about end-of-life issues and dealing with our dad passing a few years back and seeing what my mom faced and what we all faced. And everyone deals with this in one way or another. It made it even harder because the reality of mortality becomes much more clear when that happens. And Mary knows quite well, and losing her mom a few years back. But along those lines, Mary, the conversation with Patrick is really about leadership logistics, the work that had to be done at Villa Marie Claire, the changes that they made there, the impact of COVID, deadlines. How about supply chain issues, construction?
Exactly.
Someone says, what does supply chain and construction issues have to do with leadership? You say
everything. Yeah, it's leadership and logistics, and that's what he gets into. And it's funny, not even funny, haha, but you're trying to build this amazing facility that's so needed. But again, COVID reared its head, and next thing you know, you're dealing with supply chain issues. So some things are out of your control, and he addresses just really how he did that, and also bringing the team together in those challenging times and really overcoming those challenges.
not to mention partnerships, relationships, dealing with conflict, dealing with the need to negotiate. It's all about leadership, getting things done, particularly when it's an important thing to be done, like helping people have a place in their last few days, as Villa Marie Claire does. The cause and the goal is clearly laudable, but getting there, that's the question of logistics, management, leadership. And that's why we talked to Patrick Maron all about those issues and more. Let's check it out. Patrick, we're here at Villa Marie Claire, and your background's in construction.
Yes.
I'm fascinated by the concept of leadership and logistics. Like, what does it take to move a project forward, and what does that have to do with leadership versus management versus day-to-day operations? You're a leader. You've been a leader of this logistical operation to make this renovation happen. How challenging?
Very challenging. So same thing, when we started this renovation, the bulk of it, I should say, on the internal side of things, it was in the midst of the pandemic. And obviously that has its own logistical challenges and leadership challenges that came through with it across the entire healthcare spectrum. But particularly for this project, it made it difficult to really be able to work with a lot of the suppliers and vendors that came into play. And so a lot of it was, to the point that you made before, a little bit of the day-to-day operations and having to be flexible and accommodate and move around to make sure that we were still able to complete the tasks. Obviously, just have to do it through a different means than we'd initially planned for. And so I think the biggest leadership challenge that came out of this was actually about the idea of everything kind of went awry, right? So everything that we pre-planned, obviously the same way the pandemic hit for all the hospitals, really started to create some challenges really that came into play from the day-to-day. Supply chain was one of the bigger ones. The day-to-day logistics of getting contractors here because no one knew what was going on with the pandemic itself.
Yeah.
And in the contracting world, in a project to this scale and scope, you do run into delays and issues where if you don't keep on track every day, those trades, those contractors typically will go to another job. So there is a domino effect that would happen. And so the challenges of trying to maintain and keep everybody here and get the supplies, the equipment, and the answers, more importantly, from the state or even the local jurisdiction's perspective, was really some of the bigger issues that we ran into every day.
Let me ask you this, because for Lessons in Leadership on the series we do, we try to understand the mindset of leaders, particularly under pressure.
Sure.
We were under pressure.
Absolutely.
So you got deadlines, and we're obsessed. My colleague Mary Gamba and I, who our executive producer and my co-host, we talk about you got to be deadline oriented.
Absolutely.
But what you just described doesn't match up with deadlines that have to be met, or you want them to be met, but there's so many intangibles.
That's right.
So many unknowns.
Absolutely, right?
So how the heck do you manage that? Does the deadline just get kicked, pushed?
It does. So I think you have to use time really as a different scale when it comes to certain deadlines, right? Adapting to certain challenges day to day may mean that you don't hit today's deadline, but keeping the bigger picture in task with this was more important at the end of this, right? So where I lost time in the beginning from certain day-to-day challenges, we had to make up time by getting everybody here when it was appropriate to make sure that we were still able to hit deadlines. I think the biggest challenge, though, from the leadership perspective, is figuring out how to adapt to those challenges and still making sure that you meet the larger goal at hand, right? And so that, to me, was the biggest piece of this, with the day-to-days may have not always been gone as according to plan or gone well, but keeping track of those bigger goals, those bigger deadlines was the more crucial part of this, and saying, how do I make sure that within these months we're still hitting our goals, right, as opposed to how are we hitting these goals every day?
Let me ask you this, Patrick. The other leadership area that we focus on is the need for leaders to keep their head level.
Absolutely.
And to not overreact, and not also to panic and send the message to others that you are panicking.
Right.
How did you manage that?
It was difficult, and that's, I would probably say, one of the bigger lessons I learned from this whole experience of doing a renovation in the midst of a pandemic was making sure I keep my own emotions intact to keep on top of the day-to-day task and figure out each problem as it arose.
How'd you do that?
I think one of the bigger things that actually helped me through that whole process was being able to have a rapport with a lot of the contractors and saying, you know, we need to pull everybody in and do a little damage control with this whole thing, and recognizing that there are always going to be challenges and problems and variables that come into play that we weren't prepared for. But being able to say that if you have support through the team and making sure that everybody's on the same page, you can overcome any of those obstacles on each given day. And so I think the team around me that I had, that I was very fortunate to have, was a big piece of how we were able to maintain that level of composure during each day of new challenges that arose with this.
I would be remiss if I didn't ask you this.
Sure.
Because I've known your dad Mike.
Yeah,
I married
absolutely.
for so many years, and you were, I think you were probably 10 when he and I met.
Probably.
Working in an organization where your dad is the leader, a resource for you?
Absolutely. Actually, one of the bigger reasons why I first joined the Villa, right? When I was younger, when I was looking after college through different jobs and different career paths, one of the things that my father actually first taught me was the importance of finding a true mentor, right? Somebody that can really take you under their wing and show you the ins and outs of what it means to be a leader, particularly in the healthcare sphere, right? As much as you may be able to learn through your own experiences in the workforce or even through the academic style, there are intangible lessons that come from someone that's been through it, that's seen it all and done it all, that pay dividends in the long run with this whole thing. Obviously, recognizing my father's been in his position for over 35 years really made it an attractive piece where I can actually learn from someone that's not only my father, but a true leader in the healthcare sphere, and being able to bounce ideas off him and seeing how he handles problems and being able to see that firsthand and adapt it into my own ability and my own style of how I handle the day-to-day challenges of things.
Last question.
Sure.
Lessons in Leadership focuses on not just the leadership lessons that we learn, often by making mistakes, but it's to ask this question: what's the biggest change in you as a leader through this experience, this incredibly challenging and rewarding experience?
Sure, absolutely. I think the biggest change that I have is truly understanding what I call the empathetic side of working with individuals, right? So I have a lot of individuals now that work underneath me and work collectively with me, right? And understanding that everybody comes from different perspectives, different challenges, and has their own perspective on certain issues that may come into play. Being able to stay silent, right, in those meetings, in those places, and learn and listen from everybody first and foremost before I render my own opinion, right? It's not always about being right. It's about making sure that the rest of the team is on board to succeed in any of those challenges that we overcame with any of this.
What about if you know you're right and you still have to hold back?
I do. I think that's actually crucial, right?
At 30, you're pulling that off?
I do. I try to. I can't say I'm always successful with this,
You
right?
don't bat 1,000.
That's right, right? And you learn as you go. But I think it's important, right? Being able to sit back and listen to everyone first and foremost. I'm a big proponent. I try to surround myself with people that are better than me, right? I don't want to be the
certain
smartest
areas.
person in every area, right? I want to surround myself with people that are more intelligent, more experienced, have a better know of what those day-to-day challenges are, because I believe that you can never stop learning when you have people like that, and then there is no real challenge that you can't overcome, right? If I'm the only person in the room that has the answer every time, what happens when I'm not in the room, per se, right? A true manager, a true leader in my book, right? And even with this institution, I always viewed my role as something that says, if I can disappear one day and this place continues to thrive and continues to succeed, right, then I've done my job, right? That's really what it comes down to. And it's a lesson I've learned from working with the trades, working with people that are more experienced and have those certain backgrounds that come into play, and being able to say, I'm not the smartest person in the room. I don't have every bit of experience, but I want to be able to listen to everyone first and foremost before we render a decision, because maybe there's an idea or perspective that I didn't think of before I knew that I was right, right?
Thank you, Patrick.
Absolutely.
We continue our conversation about all things leadership. Mary, just to prove that this show is totally unrehearsed, unscripted. So, you have no idea what I want to talk about, but this
No,
is
I always get nervous when you do that segue, though, because it's always going to be fascinating.
Oh, maybe. So I've been watching, along with so many others, it's the 25th anniversary of The Sopranos, an extraordinary series on HBO, and celebrating the 25th anniversary. And by the way, put up our website, team, at steveadubato.org. My colleague Jackie Tricarico and I, on our series Remember Them, did a whole half-hour special on David Chase, the creator of The Sopranos, and talked to the cast of The Sopranos. But it's interesting. Why am I bringing it up? Because I'm watching Tony Soprano and the late James Gandolfini, an extraordinary actor, in a whole series of interviews with his therapist, played by Lorraine Bracco, all right, Dr. Melfi. And Tony Soprano, the character, is talking about the regrets in his life. I mean, they like all the good things, the house, the cars, the jewelry, all the things that are material. How he went about making his money is another story. And he's talking about the regrets he's had in his life, including what he's taught his children. You know, they have 2 children in the series, Meadow and AJ, Anthony. Why is it relevant? New York Times story. Check this out. Lydia Polgreen, Polgreen, wrote a story. There is no way to live a life without regret. There's no way to live a life without regret. So you ever hear people say this, Mary? I have no regrets. Ever hear that?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know what it means.
Yeah.
I have 10 this week, meaning I regret losing my temper with my wife, Jennifer, over it. Could you imagine a discussion about one of our children that we had a disagreement about, how I handled it? I regret in many ways. Mary, how much of lessons in leadership is about regrets I've had as a leader?
Yeah.
I don't understand I have no regrets, meaning you regret the things that you did or didn't do in your life that frankly could have and should have been better. That's not about comparing yourself to perfection, but it seems to me, Mary, I've got no regrets. My dad I loved my dad, but he was nuts this way. He'd say, I have no regrets.
Yeah. Well, it's funny. I'm smiling because my dad says all the time that he has no regrets.
Okay, but Mary, let me...
And I'll tell you why. And I truly believe, and I can't speak for your dad, I believe my dad truly means it. Because if you've done everything to the best of your ability in your life, there's a difference between, okay, so if you say, I regret how I handled a situation, maybe, or if I lost my temper.
How about big picture?
I think when people say it, I think they're talking big picture, right? The decisions you've made at those pivotal moments, who you chose to marry, how you raised your children, the jobs you chose to take or turn down.
The ethical and moral mistakes we make along the way.
Right. So I agree. Like there's probably 3 regrets that I have in my life, and they're all very,
Was one of them coming to work with me 24 years ago?
Yeah, Steve, now it's coming out.
This wasn't the way I wanted to happen, but go ahead.
No, absolutely not. Quite the contrary. But no, and I think that I do feel comfortable saying that I have no regrets, at least to date, because literally you need to, and if you do have any regrets, you need to confront them, and you need to make sure, and if you have that regret, you sure as heck better not do the thing that you regretted. Don't do it again. Right?
Well, I would be lying to say that hasn't happened, that I said I regretted something and never did again. I used to argue with my dad, like, let me get this straight. You built an extraordinary not-for-profit organization, North Ward Center, and the Robert Treat Academy Charter School, one of the first in the nation, very successful. But my dad will say, like, I wasn't a great dad. I wasn't there for you guys. I was too aggressive is the word I'm going to use, which is I'm being kind. And my mom's watching right now. I know, but my mom has regrets. My dad was like, I have no regrets. I go, really? Like, you wish you weren't a better dad? Like, I don't get that.
Yeah, I think the problem is we see regrets as a certain word, right? Like, I feel that when you say no regrets, you're just talking big picture, blanket comment. And I hope that when that time comes for all of us, that we're at peace and we can look back on our lives and say that we have no regrets. Of course, there's things we would have done differently, but I'm not convinced that that's a quote unquote regret.
I regret that we're out of time. I regret that we have not resolved anything. I regret that I have to go and see my therapist again to deal with these issues. For Mary Gamba, myself, and the team at Lessons in Leadership, thanks for watching. I got no regrets about this show. See you next time. This edition of Lessons in Leadership is made possible by the Buccino Leadership Institute at Seton Hall University, Prager Metis, Valley Bank, the International Union of Operating Engineers Local 825, the North Ward Center, the New Jersey Sharing Network, the Helix, Horizon Blue Cross Blue Shield of New Jersey, Fedway Associates Inc., Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, Veolia, Resourcing the World, Choose New Jersey, and Seton Hall University, showing the world what great minds can do since 1856.
This is Mary Gamba. If you want more leadership tips and tools, log on to stand-deliver.com. That's stand-deliver.com.
Promotional support for this edition of Lessons in Leadership with me, Steve Adubato, and my colleague Mary Gamba has been provided by NJ.com, NJBIA and New Jersey Business Magazine, CIANJ and Commerce Magazine, and the Meadowlands Chamber and Meadowlands Media.